That bag doesn't belong up here with the real passenger's luggage. I'll remove it myself if I have to." Amelia Dawson's words cut through the cabin like a knife, her eyes deliberately avoiding James Whitfield's gaze as she gestured dismissively toward his carry-on. What Amelia didn't know was that in exactly 36 hours, this single act would not only end her career, but transform an entire airline from the inside out. And the man standing before her, the one she'd deemed unworthy of basic courtesy, held the pen that would sign or strike Atlantic Airways' future. The air in the cabin shifted. Several passengers glanced up, then quickly away, that instinctive aversion to witnessing someone else's humiliation. A collective holding of breath as if the recycled cabin air itself could sense the weight of what was unfolding. Hartsfield-Jackson, Atlanta International Airport, hummed outside the aircraft windows, the world's busiest skyport continuing its perpetual symphony of arrivals and departures. Inside Flight 527, however, a more consequential journey was beginning, one that would redefine the invisible boundaries of dignity that exist in the narrow aisles and cramped quarters where strangers navigate shared space. In the modern theater of air travel, where humans are sorted by status and squeezed into ever-shrinking seats, the erosion of dignity had become so commonplace that most passengers had learned to expect it. To endure the scrutiny, the suspicion, the subtle and not-so-subtle judgments based on appearance rather than humanity. But sometimes dignity isn't just another item to be carelessly tossed away. Sometimes it fights back. The boarding announcement crackled over the speakers. Atlantic Airways welcomes our premium members and passengers needing special assistance to begin boarding Flight 527 to New York's John F. Kennedy International Airport. And with that ordinary invitation, an extraordinary chain of events was set in motion. James Whitfield stood patiently in the boarding line waiting for his Zone 2 group to be called. At 43, he carried himself with a quiet confidence that came from years of navigating spaces where he was often the only black face in the room. He wore dark jeans, a charcoal gray cashmere sweater, and comfortable but well-crafted leather boots, practical travel attire that prioritized comfort over making a statement. The only hint of luxury was the Rolex Submariner on his wrist, a gift to himself after closing his first major aircraft leasing deal 7 years ago. To anyone watching, he appeared to be just another passenger, perhaps a professor or mid-level executive. Nothing about his demeanor suggested that he controlled aviation assets worth billions, or that his signature could either secure or sink fleet expansion plans for multiple major airlines. And that's exactly how James preferred it. As founder and CEO of Horizon Aviation Capital, James had built a reputation as one of the most influential behind-the-scenes players in commercial aviation. His company specialized in aircraft leasing arrangements that helped airlines maintain modern fleets without the crippling upfront costs of purchasing planes outright. It was a complex relationship-driven business that few understood and even fewer mastered. James took a sip from his reusable water bottle, mentally reviewing his agenda for London. The upcoming negotiations with Atlantic Airways were particularly significant. The airline was looking to extend leases on their existing wide-body fleet while adding several new aircraft to support their ambitious expansion plans. Without favorable terms on these leases, their entire strategy would collapse. The airline executives didn't know it yet, but James was inclined to offer them exceptionally good terms, provided their operational standards met his expectations. These unannounced quality assurance flights had become something of a tradition for James. Before finalizing any major deal, he would fly the airline as an ordinary passenger, observing everything from customer service to operational efficiency. He never pulled rank or revealed his position. The insights gained from these anonymous journeys had saved him from several potentially disastrous partnerships over the years. Now boarding Zone 2 for Atlantic Airways Flight 527 to New York, announced the gate agent. James joined the line, boarding pass and ID in hand. As he scanned his documents at the gate, the agent barely looked up, offering a perfunctory, "Have a nice flight," before turning to the next passenger. The jetway stretched before him, that liminal space between ground and sky. James always found something poetic about these transitional corridors suspended between departure and arrival, briefly belonging neither here nor there. It reminded him of his own life journey navigating between worlds where he was simultaneously insider and outsider. At the aircraft door, a young Hispanic flight attendant greeted passengers with genuine warmth. "Welcome aboard," she said, her name tag identifying her as Gabriela Ramirez. Her smile reached her eyes, a rarity in customer service these days. "Thank you," James replied with a slight nod, returning her smile. He proceeded down the aisle, scanning row numbers. His seat 8C was an aisle seat in the main cabin, not business class, not basic economy. James deliberately selected these middle-tier seats during his observation flights, believing they provided the most authentic perspective on how an airline treated its average customers. As he approached his row, James noticed another flight attendant, older, with perfectly coiffed blonde hair and a rigid posture, directing a passenger struggling with an oversized bag. There was something performative about her efficiency, a sense that her helpfulness was more for show than genuine assistance. Her name tag read, Amelia Dawson, Senior Flight Attendant. James made a mental note of her demeanor, but continued to his seat without comment. This trip to London wasn't just another business journey. The outcome of his negotiations would impact thousands of jobs and potentially reshape Atlantic Airways' future. But before he could commit to that partnership, he needed to know what kind of company he was really dealing with, not just in boardrooms, but in the everyday experiences of their passengers. Little did he know that this routine observation flight was about to become much more than a standard evaluation. Amelia Dawson had started her shift that morning with the familiar sense of weary irritation that had become her baseline emotion over 12 years of flight service. At 39, she considered herself a guardian of standards in an industry that, in her view, had grown dangerously lax. She'd joined Atlantic Airways when appearance requirements were still strictly enforced and customer accommodation had clear limits. Now, with every passing year, she watched with mounting dismay as the airline relaxed dress codes, softened language policies, and increasingly catered to what she privately called the entitlement generation. "Coffee stain," she muttered to herself, spotting a small brown mark on her otherwise immaculate navy uniform sleeve. Amelia ducked into the forward galley, retrieving a stain removal pen from her personal kit. The tiny imperfection vanished with a few precise strokes. Perfect appearance was non-negotiable in Amelia's personal rulebook. The Atlanta to JFK route was typically filled with business travelers who, in Amelia's experience, fell into two categories: the genuinely important people who belonged in premium cabins, and the aspirational types who didn't quite fit. Over the years, she'd developed what she considered an unerring instinct for distinguishing between the two. It was an unwritten part of her job, she believed, to maintain the integrity of these boundaries. 12 customer complaints had been filed against her in the past 18 months. None had advanced beyond initial review. Amelia knew exactly how to phrase her responses, always citing safety protocols, company policies, or cabin management necessities. The system protected her, and she protected the system. It was a comfortable arrangement. "Gabriella, please ensure all Zone 1 passengers are settled before we begin Zone 2. Amelia instructed her junior colleague with barely concealed condescension. Gabriela Ramirez, 26, and only 8 months into her flight attendant career, nodded politely. "Yes, of course," she replied, her slight accent making Amelia inwardly cringe. Gabriella had quickly become popular with both passengers and crew for her genuine warmth and problem-solving abilities, facts that Amelia found vaguely threatening. "And remember, overhead bins are for approved carry-ons only," Amelia added unnecessarily. "Not for coats, small bags, or oversized items." Gabriella nodded again, suppressing a sigh. She'd memorized the policies, as Amelia well knew. This was just another reminder of the hierarchy between them. As Zone 2 boarding began, Amelia positioned herself strategically at the front of the cabin, mentally cataloging potential situation passengers, those who might require additional guidance to comply with her interpretation of airline policies. Her eyes narrowed as a large family with small children entered, already calculating how their disruptive presence might impact her carefully maintained cabin order. "Excuse me, that bag needs to go under the seat," she instructed a young woman attempting to place a purse in the overhead bin. The passenger complied without protest, exactly as expected. This was Amelia's domain, her carefully controlled territory. Here her word was effectively law. The captain might command the cockpit, but the cabin was her realm. Every flight was an opportunity to reinforce this authority, especially with those passengers who, in her estimation, needed to be reminded of their place. As she surveyed the boarding process, Amelia noticed a black man in casual attire entering the aircraft. Something about his relaxed demeanor instantly registered as a potential disruption to her sense of order. He wasn't being loud or breaking any rules, but his comfortable confidence somehow felt like a challenge. She watched him closely as he made his way down the aisle, already calculating how to assert her authority if the opportunity presented itself. Minutes earlier, she had warmly welcomed a white businessman in a rumpled suit to first class, even helping him stow his clearly oversized bag. Now her eyes narrowed at James's standard-sized carry-on, measuring not its dimensions, but the worth she assigned its owner. Another day, another flight, another chance to ensure everyone stayed in their proper place. James moved efficiently through the narrow aisle toward his seat, careful not to bump other passengers with his roller bag. The Boeing 737's interior was standard blue seats, beige overhead bins, the artificial cool of recycled air. A family with small children was settling into the row ahead, the parents performing the familiar choreography of distributing snacks and toys while strapping wiggling bodies into seatbelts. As James reached row 8, he noticed that the overhead bins above were already filling up. He spotted a space a few rows ahead that would easily accommodate his standard-sized carry-on. He moved forward, lifted his bag, and was about to place it in the bin when he felt a presence behind him. "Excuse me." Amelia's voice cut through the ambient cabin noise. "That's not your assigned bin space." James turned, meeting her gaze with calm neutrality. "Good afternoon. The bins above my seat are full. I'm just using the available space here." "Those bins are reserved for the passengers seated in these rows," Amelia replied, her tone suggesting she was explaining something to a child. "I understand," James said evenly, "but as you can see, there's plenty of room and other bins are full." Amelia's lips tightened almost imperceptibly. "Well, your bag seems oversized anyway. May I check the dimensions?" James raised an eyebrow slightly but maintained his composure. "It's a standard carry-on that I've flown with dozens of times, including on Atlantic Airways. It meets all the posted requirements." He could have mentioned that he'd personally approved the purchase of several dozen aircraft currently in Atlantic Airways' fleet. He could have noted that the company's CEO had called him just yesterday to discuss refinancing options. But that wasn't James's style. He believed in the dignity of anonymity, in observing the true character of people and organizations when they didn't know they were being watched. "Looks too large to me," Amelia insisted, her voice growing louder. Several nearby passengers glanced up from their pre-flight routines, sensing conflict. "You'll need to check it gateside. I'm happy to demonstrate that it fits perfectly in the sizer at the gate if there's an actual concern," James offered reasonably. He pulled out his phone. "I also have the airline's official dimensions saved here if you'd like to check." Amelia's expression hardened. "Sir, you're holding up the boarding process. Either check the bag or stow it under the seat in front of you." The cabin had grown quieter as more passengers tuned into the exchange. James weighed his options. This was exactly the kind of interaction he was here to observe, though he'd hoped to be a witness rather than a participant. "Under the seat won't work for a hard-sided roller bag," he stated calmly. "And this bag is well within your airline's size limits. I'm just trying to use available space efficiently." "Sir," Amelia's voice took on an edge that made the underlying message clear. "You don't look like someone who should be questioning me. I'm going to have to insist. Gate check or under the seat. Those are your options." From the corner of his eye, James noticed Gabriella hovering nearby, looking uncomfortable with her colleague's approach. She stepped forward tentatively. "Amelia, there's plenty of room in that bin. The flight is nearly full, so we should... I've got this handled." "Thank you." Amelia cut her off sharply. She turned back to James. "Your decision, sir. We have other passengers waiting to board." James took a deep breath. He could escalate this into something bigger, but that wouldn't serve his purpose today. His goal was to observe the airline's operations, not become the center of attention. "I'll gate check it," he conceded, his voice level. "Wise choice," Amelia replied with a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You can leave it by the aircraft door and it'll be waiting for you in New York." As James turned to leave, he caught the eye of an older black woman seated nearby. Her expression communicated a silent message of shared understanding, the weary recognition of a familiar pattern. She gave him the slightest nod, an acknowledgement of solidarity in the face of casual indignity. James nodded, turned, and walked back toward the front of the aircraft. As he passed Gabriella, she gave him an apologetic look. "I'm sorry about that, sir," she whispered. "It really should fit fine." "Not your fault," James assured her quietly. As he handed his bag to the gate agent, James made a mental note about the interaction. One difficult employee didn't define an entire airline, but how organizations handled such employees often revealed their true values. He returned to his seat without further comment, nodding politely to the elderly woman now seated in the window position of his row. "Quite a fuss over a bag," she remarked sympathetically. James gave her a measured smile. "Some battles aren't worth fighting." But as he settled in, he couldn't help wondering how many other passengers had been subjected to similar treatment, particularly those who lacked the resources or confidence to push back. The incident itself was minor, but its implications were not. The quiet dignity you carry matters more than any bag they can take away, the woman beside him murmured almost to herself. James turned to her with newfound interest. "That's a powerful perspective." "When you've lived as long as I have," she replied, "you learn which battles change you and which change the world. The trick is knowing the difference." Her words settled into James's thoughts as the final passengers boarded. What had begun as a simple observation flight was evolving into something more profound, a test not just of Atlantic Airways' service standards, but of James's own understanding of how to use the power he wielded. What James didn't know was that this was merely the prelude to a far more troubling display of bias that would unfold within the hour. The aircraft had reached cruising altitude when James noticed movement in the aisle beside him. A man in his mid-30s with warm brown skin and dark hair tied back in a neat bun was returning from the lavatory. James recognized him from boarding. He'd been seated several rows behind in 14A, and had cheerfully helped an elderly passenger stow her luggage earlier. According to the Spanish-language novel that had peeked out of his backpack, James guessed he might be Hispanic. The man whose name James would later learn was Alejandro Morales slipped back into his seat without fanfare. Nothing about the moment suggested it would become pivotal in what was about to unfold. Approximately 20 minutes later, the flight hit a patch of moderate turbulence. The seatbelt sign chimed on, and Amelia made an announcement instructing all passengers to return to their seats immediately. James noticed her particular emphasis on immediately delivered with the subtle satisfaction of someone who enjoys exercising authority. As the turbulence subsided and the captain turned off the seatbelt sign, the usual rustling of passengers resuming their activities filled the cabin. James was reviewing some preliminary notes on his tablet when a movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. Amelia was standing near Alejandro's row, peering into the overhead bin with a peculiar expression, something between irritation and satisfaction, like someone who'd found exactly what they were looking for, especially when what they were looking for was a problem. James watched as she reached up and removed a black duffel bag from the bin. There was nothing remarkable about the bag itself. Standard size, black canvas with a silver zipper, the type thousands of travelers carried every day. What was remarkable was what Amelia did next. Rather than asking nearby passengers about the bag's ownership or making an announcement, she tucked it under her arm and walked briskly toward the forward galley. Something about her purposeful stride and furtive glances made James's instincts prickle. He unbuckled his seatbelt and leaned slightly into the aisle, maintaining visual contact as she disappeared into the galley. What he witnessed next stunned him. Through the partial opening between the galley curtains, James clearly saw Amelia take the black duffel bag and deliberately place it inside a large plastic trash bag, the kind crew used for collecting cabin waste. Her actions were quick and furtive, clearly not meant for passenger observation. The sight hit James with unexpected force, not just the action itself, but what it represented. In that plastic trash bag lay more than canvas and zippers. It contained someone's dignity, casually discarded by a person who'd decided they weren't worthy of basic respect. James remained half standing in his seat, gaze fixed on the galley entrance. When Amelia emerged a moment later without the bag, his suspicions were confirmed. She noticed his attention and frowned. "Is there something you need, sir?" Her voice carried a warning tone. "I'm curious about that bag you just took from the overhead bin," James said evenly, loud enough to be heard but not confrontational. "It's being handled according to protocol," she replied dismissively. "Please return to your seat. What protocol involves putting a passenger's bag in the trash?" James asked, his voice still measured but firm. Amelia's eyes widened slightly. She hadn't expected to be observed. Several nearby passengers were now tuning into the exchange. "That's not what happened," she said firmly, though her reddening face suggested otherwise. "We're securing an unattended item." By placing it in a garbage bag, James pressed. The older woman beside James leaned forward slightly. "I saw it too," she said quietly but clearly. "She put that bag in the trash." Amelia's gaze flicked between them, a flash of uncertainty crossing her features before her expression hardened again. "As I said, we're following protocol for unsecured items during turbulence." James sat back down but kept his attention on the developing situation. Approximately 10 minutes later, a commotion arose several rows behind him. "Excuse me, my bag is missing." Alejandro's voice carried a note of rising panic. "I had a black duffel bag in the overhead bin and now it's gone." James watched as Alejandro checked adjacent bins, becoming increasingly distressed. Other passengers began looking around, shaking their heads to indicate they hadn't seen anything. Gabriella responded to Alejandro's call button, her expression concerned. "When did you last see your bag, sir?" "It was right here before the turbulence," Alejandro explained, gesturing to the overhead bin. "I put it there during boarding. It has my laptop work documents, everything including a birthday gift for my mother. Let me check with my colleague." Gabriella offered, moving toward the galley where Amelia was deliberately focusing on arranging beverage cups. James made a decision. He stood again and addressed Gabriella. "Excuse me," he said clearly. "I saw what happened to that bag." All eyes turned to him. The cabin fell silent, that peculiar hush that falls when strangers suddenly find themselves witnesses to something significant. "The senior flight attendant removed it from the bin during turbulence and took it to the forward galley," James stated calmly. "I observed her placing it inside a trash bag." A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin. Alejandro's face registered shock, then anger. "Is this true?" he demanded, looking from James to Gabriella to Amelia, who had emerged from the galley with a defensive posture. "Sir, please lower your voice," Amelia said to Alejandro, ignoring James completely. "If your bag was removed, it was because it was unattended and potentially a security concern." "Unattended?" Alejandro's voice rose in disbelief. "I was in my assigned seat except for a 3-minute bathroom visit during which we hit turbulence." Amelia's jaw tightened. "Passengers are responsible for their belongings at all times. That doesn't explain why it would be put in the trash, James interjected, his voice remaining measured but firm. That's not standard protocol for handling passenger property. Phones were rising now, recording the confrontation. A business traveler across the aisle whispered to his seatmate, "This is outrageous." The tension in the cabin was palpable. Other passengers were now openly watching, some with phones partially raised, sensing they were witnessing something significant. "I want my bag back. Now." Alejandro's demand was reasonable but unyielding. Amelia glanced around, clearly calculating her options. The situation was rapidly escalating beyond her control. With visible reluctance, she turned to Gabriella. "Check the forward galley," she instructed curtly. Gabriella hurried to the front, returning moments later with the black duffel bag, now slightly smudged from its time in the trash bag. She handed it directly to Alejandro with a deeply apologetic expression. "I am so sorry about this, sir," she said sincerely. Alejandro immediately unzipped the bag, checking its contents with visible anxiety. His laptop documents and a small gift box appeared intact, though the bag itself now bore a coffee stain on one side. "Why was my property thrown in the trash?" he demanded, looking directly at Amelia. "I deserve an explanation." Amelia's face had hardened into a mask of authority under threat. "Your bag was unsecured during turbulence. It was temporarily removed for safety reasons." In the trash, Alejandro's incredulity was echoed in the expressions of nearby passengers. "It was a temporary holding location," Amelia insisted, doubling down rather than acknowledging the inappropriate action. James observed the exchange with growing concern. This was no longer about customer service deficiencies or minor policy overreach. What he was witnessing spoke to deeper, more troubling patterns. "That's not standard procedure for handling passenger belongings." James stated, his voice quiet but carrying authority that seemed to surprise Amelia. "And I think you know that. Sir, you've been disruptive since boarding." Amelia turned on him. "Please stay out of matters that don't concern you." Actually, an older woman spoke up from across the aisle. "I saw it too. She definitely put that bag in the trash, not in any secure location." Murmurs of support rose from several passengers. The collective witness was becoming impossible to dismiss. A middle-aged white man in a business suit stood up from his seat. "I've flown over 2 million miles and I've never seen an airline throw a passenger's belongings in the trash. This is completely unacceptable." Amelia's face flushed with anger. "This is ridiculous. I was following protocol for unsecured items." "By throwing them in the garbage," Alejandro challenged. "Would you have done that to any passenger's bag or just mine?" The implication hung in the air, uncomfortable but impossible to ignore. "Are you accusing me of something?" Amelia's voice took on a dangerous edge. "I'm stating facts," Alejandro replied firmly. "My bag was in its proper place. I was away from my seat for minutes during turbulence. You removed my property without notification and placed it in the trash. Those are the facts." James watched Amelia closely. In crisis moments, true character emerged, and what he was seeing troubled him deeply. Rather than de-escalating or acknowledging error, she was becoming more defensive and hostile. "This conversation is over," she declared. "Return to your seats immediately, or I'll be forced to report disruptive behavior to the captain." The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't just awkward, it was the sound of collective judgment of dozens of witnesses recognizing an injustice that could no longer be hidden behind protocol or authority. Dignity isn't something that can be thrown away like trash, James said, his voice quiet but carrying throughout the hushed cabin. Unlike that bag once lost, it's much harder to recover. The words landed with such weight that even Amelia seemed momentarily at a loss for response. Several passengers nodded in agreement. Others looked down, perhaps reflecting on times they had witnessed similar situations, and remained silent. Alejandro stood his ground. "I want your name and employee ID number. I'm filing a formal complaint the moment we land." Do whatever you want, Amelia replied dismissively. Now sit down. The confrontation had drawn the attention of nearly everyone in the main cabin. Phones were now openly recording the exchange. James remained calm but watchful, making mental notes not just of the incident itself, but of how it was being handled or mishandled by Atlantic Airways' senior cabin crew member. Gabriella stepped forward clearly, trying to salvage the situation. Mr. Morales, I want to personally apologize for this incident. We'll make sure this is properly addressed when we land. Can I bring you something to drink or anything to make the rest of your flight more comfortable? Her genuine concern provided stark contrast to Amelia's hostility. Alejandro nodded, his anger visibly tempered by Gabriella's sincerity. Thank you, he said. Water would be good. As the immediate tension began to dissipate, James caught Alejandro's eye and gave him a subtle nod of support. Their shared moment of silent acknowledgement carried the weight of a familiar experience, the recognition of dignity under assault, and the quiet solidarity of standing firm against it. For the remaining hour of the flight to JFK, an uneasy calm settled over the cabin. But beneath that superficial peace, James knew that something significant had transpired, something that demanded response rather than passive observation. The flight that had begun as a routine evaluation had transformed into a test of values, not just for Atlantic Airways, but for James himself. The descent into JFK International Airport brought a tense silence to the cabin of Flight 527. The usual rustling of passengers gathering belongings and preparing for landing seemed subdued, overshadowed by the incident that had unfolded at 35,000 feet. James remained in his seat, outwardly calm but inwardly calculating his next steps. As the aircraft's wheels touched down with a gentle bump, James unlocked his phone and opened a secure messaging app. His longtime executive assistant, Vanessa Powell, had already sent several updates about his London meetings, but those now seemed secondary to the situation at hand. Need documentation on our current lease arrangements with Atlantic Airways forwarded to my email immediately, James typed. Also, current contract negotiation terms for upcoming agreement. We'll explain later. Vanessa's response came within seconds. On it. Everything okay? Evaluating that now, James replied. Also need contact information for their executive customer service department. The plane taxied slowly to the gate, the captain's voice announcing local time and weather conditions in the practiced monotone of someone who had delivered the same script thousands of times. As passengers began to stand and retrieve their belongings, James noticed Amelia stationed near the forward exit, her posture rigid and expression tightly controlled. She was avoiding eye contact with passengers, particularly Alejandro, who was still seated several rows behind James. Gabriella, however, was moving through the cabin offering assistance and making genuine connections with departing travelers. The contrast between the two flight attendants couldn't have been more striking, one wielding authority like a weapon, the other offering service with authentic humanity. James remained seated, allowing other passengers to deplane first. This gave him an opportunity to observe the aftermath and potentially connect with Alejandro. As the cabin gradually emptied, he saw his chance. "Excuse me, James," said, approaching Alejandro as he prepared to exit. "I wanted to check if you're all right after what happened." Alejandro looked up, recognition crossing his features. "You're the one who saw her take my bag," he stated rather than asked. "Thank you for speaking up. I might never have known what really happened otherwise." "No one should be treated that way," James replied simply. "I'm filing a complaint," Alejandro said, his voice reflecting both determination and fatigue. "For whatever good that will do." James nodded. "I'd like to give you my contact information if that's all right. I witnessed the whole thing and would be willing to provide a statement if needed." Alejandro looked momentarily surprised by the offer, then grateful. They exchanged information quickly as the final passengers filtered past them toward the exit. "I appreciate this," Alejandro said. "Most people just look away." "Too many do," James agreed. "Good luck with your mother's birthday celebration." The older woman who had been seated near James approached them. "I got it all on video," she said quietly. "Every second from when she took the bag to when she denied it. My name's Eleanor. I'd be happy to share it if you need evidence for your complaint." Alejandro's expression brightened slightly. "That would be incredibly helpful, thank you." They quickly exchanged contact information, forming an impromptu alliance against the injustice they'd witnessed. As they approached the aircraft door, Amelia stood with the forced smile of someone performing professionalism rather than embodying it. "Thank you for flying with Atlantic Airways," she recited mechanically, her eyes sliding past them without real acknowledgement. James paused briefly. "I'll be submitting a report about today's flight." He said his tone neutral but clear. "Both the concerning incidents and the exemplary service provided by your colleague." For a fleeting moment, uncertainty flickered across Amelia's face, the first crack in her armor of authority. Then her expression hardened again. "That's your right, sir," she replied dismissively. "Have a nice day." In the jetway, Alejandro turned to James. "I need to run to make my connection to Boston, but thank you again. I'll be in touch." As Alejandro hurried ahead, James walked deliberately through the terminal, his mind already mapping out the next phase of his response. The incident itself was troubling enough, but Amelia's reaction, the doubling down, the dismissiveness, the clear lack of accountability, suggested something deeper than an isolated employee problem. His phone buzzed with an incoming message from Vanessa documents sent to your secure email. Atlantic Airways executive contacts included. London team is expecting confirmation about tomorrow's meeting by 5 p.m. EST. James checked his watch. He had a 3-hour layover before his connecting flight to London, just enough time to set certain wheels in motion. Instead of heading to the general terminal area, James took an elevator to the upper level where airline lounges were located. Though he wasn't traveling in business class today, his status as a significant industry player meant doors typically closed to ordinary passengers would open for him if he chose to identify himself. Today, he would make that choice. Not out of ego or desire for special treatment, but because what he had witnessed demanded immediate attention from people with the authority to address it properly. As he approached the Atlantic Airways Premium Lounge, James thought about Alejandro, about his own gate-checked bag, and about all the passengers who encountered barriers large and small based solely on perception and prejudice. This wasn't just about enforcing airline policy. It was about basic human dignity and the responsibility that came with power, regardless of whether that power was displayed on a name badge or held quietly behind the scenes. With that clarity of purpose, James presented himself at the lounge reception desk, prepared to transform from anonymous observer to influential actor in Atlantic Airways' future. The Atlantic Airways Premium Lounge entrance featured sleek marble counters and the airline's signature blue lighting. A receptionist with a practiced smile greeted James as he approached. "Good afternoon, sir. May I see your boarding pass and status card?" James presented his economy class boarding pass for his connecting flight to London. "I don't have status with Atlantic Airways," he said calmly, "but I believe Natalie Fontaine might want to speak with me. Would you please let her know that James Whitfield is here?" The receptionist's expression flickered between confusion and polite dismissal. "I'm sorry, sir, but without premium status or a business class ticket, I can't." "Please just call Ms. Fontaine." James interrupted gently. "Tell her it concerns Atlantic Airways' upcoming fleet expansion and today's incident on Flight 527 from Atlanta." Something in his tone must have registered because the receptionist hesitated, then reached for her phone. After a brief hushed conversation, she looked up with newly attentive eyes. "Ms. Fontaine will be right out to meet you, Mr. Whitfield. Please make yourself comfortable." Less than 2 minutes later, a woman in her early 40s with a tailored navy suit and an expression of controlled curiosity emerged from the lounge doors. Natalie Fontaine, Atlantic Airways Customer Experience Manager for North American Operations, extended her hand. "Mr. Whitfield, I'm Natalie Fontaine. "This is unexpected, but certainly an honor. Please come in." As they walked through the premium lounge toward a private meeting room in the back, James noted the contrast between this rarefied space with its abundant food displays, comfortable seating, and attentive staff, and the cramped conditions in main cabin where most passengers spent their journeys. The physical gap between these environments perfectly mirrored the disparity in treatment he'd just witnessed. Once seated in the privacy of the small conference room, Natalie's professional demeanor remained intact, but her eyes reflected growing concern. "Your assistant forwarded some documentation that suggests you're significantly involved with our fleet financing," she began carefully. "I admit I'm surprised to find you traveling in economy today." "I travel as an ordinary passenger quite regularly," James replied. "It provides valuable perspective." "I see." Natalie nodded slowly. "And you mentioned an incident on today's flight from Atlanta." "Two incidents, actually," James said, his voice level but authoritative, both involving the same senior flight attendant and both deeply concerning. Over the next 15 minutes, James recounted the events in precise detail, from the unnecessary confrontation over his properly sized carry-on to the shocking disposal of Alejandro's bag in the trash. He described Amelia's defensive response when confronted her refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing and her thinly veiled hostility toward both men. Natalie listened intently, her expression growing more troubled with each detail. She took careful notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "This is extremely disturbing," she said when James finished. "I want to personally apologize for your experience. This behavior is completely unacceptable and contrary to our service standards." I appreciate that James responded, but I'm less concerned with apologies than with action. What happens next matters more than acknowledging what's already happened. Natalie straightened in her chair. "We have clear protocols for incidents like this. Ms. Dawson will be placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. We'll gather statements from other crew members and passengers, review any available documentation." "Let me be clear about something," James interrupted calmly. "I'm not just reporting this incident as an inconvenienced passenger. I'm raising it as someone who has a significant stake in Atlantic Airways' future." He pulled out his tablet and opened the documents Vanessa had sent. "As you can see, my company currently holds leases on 17 aircraft in your fleet. We're scheduled to discuss extending those agreements and adding 5 new wide-body jets at tomorrow's meeting in London, a deal worth approximately $2.8 billion over 12 years. The color drained slightly from Natalie's face as she processed the implications. I wasn't fully aware of the scope of our relationship. Few people are James acknowledged. I prefer it that way. It allows me to see organizations as they truly are, not as they present themselves when they know they're being evaluated." He leaned forward slightly. "What I witnessed today speaks to something deeper than one employee's poor judgment. It suggests a culture where such behavior can occur without immediate correction from colleagues or supervisors. And that concerns me greatly as I consider our ongoing partnership." The subtext was clear. The aircraft lease negotiations now hung in the balance. Natalie took a deep breath. "Mr. Whitfield, I assure you this incident doesn't reflect our values as an organization. Ms. Dawson's actions were completely out of line with our policies and training." "Yet they happened," James countered. "And based on her confidence in acting that way, I suspect they've happened before, perhaps many times, just without someone like me witnessing and speaking up." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. "I'm not interested in punitive measures against one employee. I'm interested in understanding how Atlantic Airways plans to address the underlying issues that allowed this situation to develop in the first place." Natalie nodded slowly, recognizing both the seriousness of the situation and the opportunity it presented. "You're right. While we will absolutely address Ms. Dawson's behavior, we need to look at the bigger picture." She straightened her posture, shifting from defensive to proactive. "I'd like to propose a comprehensive approach. Beyond the immediate investigation, we can implement enhanced bias awareness training for all customer-facing staff, strengthen our reporting systems for incidents like these, and establish clear accountability metrics for managers. That sounds promising, James acknowledged. But I'd also like to ensure the other passenger affected today receives proper attention. His name is Alejandro Morales. He had a connecting flight to Boston, so he's probably still in the terminal. Of course, Natalie agreed immediately. I'll have someone locate him and bring him here. He deserves a personal apology and appropriate compensation for his experience. And the junior flight attendant, Gabriela Ramirez James, added. She attempted to intervene and provide proper service despite her senior colleague's behavior. That kind of integrity should be recognized and encouraged. Natalie made a note. I'll speak with her personally. People who uphold our true values, even in difficult circumstances, are exactly who we want to advance within the organization. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Natalie's assistant poked her head in. I'm sorry to interrupt, but Mr. Morales has been located near gate C42. Should I ask him to come to the lounge? Yes, please, Natalie confirmed, and arrange a complimentary pass regardless of his ticketing status. As the assistant departed, James and Natalie continued their discussion, moving from addressing the immediate incident to broader questions about corporate culture, accountability, and the values that truly guided Atlantic Airways beyond their mission statements and marketing materials. Suddenly, all the screens in the conference room simultaneously illuminated, displaying James's name photo and title, James Whitfield, CEO, Horizon Aviation Capital, current lessor of 17 Atlantic Airways aircraft. Natalie blinked in surprise at the dramatic display. James raised an eyebrow. I didn't authorize that. It's automatic when certain VIPs enter our facilities, Natalie explained, visibly flustered by the system's recognition of his importance. I'll have it disabled. Please do, James replied. Our conversation is more productive when we focus on substance rather than status. The screens went dark, but the impact remained a visual representation of the power dynamics at play. In that moment, the contrast was stark between how James had been treated as an anonymous black traveler versus how the system responded to his name and position. By the time Alejandro was escorted into the meeting room 20 minutes later, looking bewildered by his sudden VIP treatment, James and Natalie had outlined the framework for something more substantial than a routine customer service resolution. They had begun mapping a potential transformation in how the airline identified, addressed, and prevented the kinds of subtle and not-so-subtle discrimination that too often characterized the modern travel experience. Alejandro's eyes widened with recognition when he saw James. You're here too. What's going on, Mr. Morales? Natalie stood to greet him. I'm Natalie Fontaine, Customer Experience Manager. We've asked you here because we want to address what happened on your flight today. And it seems you already know Mr. Whitfield. We met on the plane. Alejandro confirmed, glancing between them with growing curiosity. Please have a seat, Natalie offered. We have a lot to discuss. As Alejandro settled into a chair, James caught his eye with a subtle nod that carried an unspoken message. Your dignity matters. And sometimes justice comes from unexpected directions. The conversation that followed would reshape not just one passenger's experience or one employee's career, but potentially the underlying culture of an entire airline. And it all began because someone chose to see what others ignored and to speak when others remained silent. They put my bag in the trash. Alejandro's voice rose in disbelief as Natalie explained what James had witnessed. I knew it was missing, but in the trash. The private meeting room in the Atlantic Airways lounge had become a space of uncomfortable revelations. Alejandro Morales sat with his recovered duffel bag clutched protectively on his lap, as if afraid it might be taken again. I cannot begin to express how deeply sorry we are, Natalie said, her professional composure momentarily cracking to reveal genuine distress. This behavior is completely unacceptable." Alejandro ran a hand through his dark hair, visibly processing the information. "When I couldn't find my bag, I thought maybe another passenger had moved it by mistake. It never occurred to me that a flight attendant would deliberately—" His voice trailed off, the full implications sinking in. "That's why I spoke up," James explained quietly. "What I witnessed wasn't a mistake or misunderstanding. It was a deliberate action." Alejandro turned to James with newfound appreciation. "If you hadn't said anything, I probably would have filed a lost item report and never known what really happened." He shook his head. "How many other times has something like this happened to passengers who didn't have someone watching out for them?" The question hung in the air, uncomfortable but necessary. "That's exactly what we need to determine," Natalie acknowledged. "Mr. Morales, I'd like to hear about your entire experience today from the moment you arrived at the gate in Atlanta. Every detail matters." For the next 20 minutes, Alejandro recounted his journey. He described boarding the aircraft, being greeted warmly by Gabriella, but receiving only a perfunctory nod from Amelia. He noted how he'd helped an elderly woman with her luggage, after which Amelia had given him a look of what he described as annoyed surprise. He detailed the brief bathroom visit during turbulence and his panic upon returning to find his bag missing. "The thing is," Alejandro added, "I travel for work all the time. I know the routines, the rules. I'm always careful to follow them precisely because he hesitated. Then continued with painful honesty, because I know that sometimes people like me are watched more closely given less benefit of the doubt." Natalie nodded, making notes but maintaining eye contact. "And when you discovered your bag was missing, what was Ms. Dawson's response?" "She acted like I was being unreasonable for even asking about it." Alejandro said, frustration evident in his voice, like I was creating a problem rather than responding to one. If Mr. Whitfield hadn't spoken up. He glanced at James gratefully. As the conversation continued, a knock at the door interrupted them. A young Hispanic man in an Atlantic Airways uniform entered with a tablet in hand. "Ms. Fontaine, I have the preliminary incident report you requested," he said, handing her the device. "Thank you, Luis," she replied. "Mr. Morales, this is Luis Hernandez from our customer advocacy team. Luis, this is Mr. Morales, the passenger we discussed." Luis nodded respectfully to Alejandro. "Sir, I've been assigned to document your experience in detail and ensure appropriate follow-up. We take this matter extremely seriously." Alejandro looked surprised at the sudden attention. "I was going to file a complaint at the service desk, but I didn't expect all of this." He gestured to the private room, the management presence, the formal documentation process. "Most passengers don't receive this level of response," James observed quietly, the unspoken reality evident to everyone in the room. Natalie had the grace to look uncomfortable with this truth. "You're right, Mr. Whitfield, and that's part of what needs to change." She turned to Alejandro. "Your experience matters to us, Mr. Morales, not because of who else is in this room, or because of potential publicity, but because no passenger should ever be treated with such disrespect." For the next hour, Luis worked with Alejandro to document every detail of the incident, while Natalie and James continued their broader discussion about accountability and cultural change. The atmosphere was one of focused determination rather than mere damage control. When they finally prepared to depart, Alejandro to his rescheduled flight to Boston, James to continue preparations for his London meeting, and Natalie to begin implementing immediate response measures, Luis presented Alejandro with an envelope. "Sir, in addition to formal documentation and follow-up, we've arranged complimentary upgrades for your return journey, compensation for today's distress, and a direct contact line for any future concerns," Luis explained. "Ms. Fontaine has also approved a donation in your name to the education charity listed in your customer profile." Alejandro appeared momentarily overcome, blinking rapidly. "Thank you. That's unexpected. It's the least we can do, Natalie responded. But more importantly, I want you to know that this incident will lead to real changes in how we operate. Your experience today, painful as it was, may help prevent countless others from facing similar treatment. As they prepared to leave the lounge, Alejandro turned to James. You didn't have to get involved. Most people wouldn't have. That's precisely why I had to, James replied. When we stay silent in the face of injustice, we become part of the problem. Alejandro nodded, understanding dawning. You know my mother always says that dignity isn't what others give you. It's what no one can take away unless you let them. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. James smiled. I hope her birthday is wonderful. It will be, Alejandro said with newfound certainty, because I'll be telling her about how one person's willingness to speak up made all the difference. They shook hands, a gesture that carried the weight of shared understanding about what it meant to stand firm in one's dignity, regardless of how others might try to diminish it. What had begun as a chance encounter between strangers on a flight was evolving into something more profound, an alliance built on mutual respect and recognition. As Alejandro departed with Luis to make his connection, Natalie turned to James. This isn't over, Mr. Whitfield. I hope you'll see meaningful action by the time you return from London. I'll be watching closely, James assured her. Not just for my company's interests, but for Alejandro's and for every passenger who deserves to be treated with basic human respect, regardless of how they look or what cabin they're seated in. With that, he gathered his belongings and headed toward international departures, his resolve strengthened by the day's events. What had begun as a routine observation flight had evolved into something far more consequential, not just for Atlantic Airways, but for his own understanding of how he might use his position to effect meaningful change. James settled into his seat aboard the Boeing 777, bound for London Heathrow, surprised to find himself in business class despite having booked an economy ticket. Natalie Fontaine's influence, no doubt a gesture that, while appreciated for the additional comfort on the transatlantic journey, underscored the very issues they had discussed in the lounge. The cabin crew greeted him with the polished warmth reserved for premium passengers, attentive, but not intrusive, respectful, without being deferential. James accepted their offers of pre-departure beverages and hot towels with quiet gratitude, all while noting the sharp contrast between this experience and the main cabin service he'd observed earlier in the day. As the aircraft lifted into the evening sky above New York, James opened his laptop to review the documents Vanessa had sent. The upcoming negotiations with Atlantic Airways had taken on additional dimensions now. What had been primarily a business decision evaluating fleet requirements, financing terms, and operational projections had become intertwined with questions of corporate culture and values. His secure email contained several urgent messages from Atlantic Airways executives, all sent within the past hour. Clearly, word of his encounter with Natalie Fontaine had reached the highest levels of the organization. From Bradley Thompson, CFO, Mr. Whitfield. I've been briefed on today's unfortunate incident. Please be assured this matter has our fullest attention. Looking forward to our productive discussions tomorrow. From Diana Ferris, VP of Fleet Management, deeply troubled by what I'm hearing about your experience today. This doesn't reflect our values or standards. Eager to address this directly during our meeting. James read the messages without immediately responding. Their urgent tone reflected understanding of the financial stakes involved, but he would wait to see if they truly grasped the deeper issues at hand. A flight attendant approached with a glass of water. Mr. Whitfield, the purser, asked me to ensure you have everything you need for a comfortable flight. Thank you. I'm fine for now, James replied with a small smile. As the attendant departed, James reflected on how quickly special treatment materialized when one's importance became known. The same airline that had questioned his right to basic courtesy hours earlier was now falling over itself to ensure his comfort. The irony wasn't lost on him. His mind drifted to an incident early in his career, long before Horizon Aviation Capital had become a major player in the industry. At 32, fresh from securing his first significant investment backing, James had attended an aviation finance conference in Singapore. Dressed in the casual attire he preferred when not in formal meetings, he had attempted to enter the executive lounge area during a break between sessions. "Excuse me," the attendant had said with practiced politeness that did little to mask her skepticism. "This area is for conference speakers and registered executives only." James had presented his credentials, the same VIP badge worn by the white executives who had entered unchallenged moments before. "I'll need to verify this," she had insisted, making a phone call while James waited, acutely aware of curious glances from others in the vicinity. After confirmation, she had offered a tight smile with no apology. "You're cleared to enter, Mr. Whitfield." That moment had crystallized something for James. Success wasn't just about building wealth or influence. It was about creating enough power to ensure such incidents became increasingly rare, not just for himself, but for everyone who faced similar barriers based solely on appearance. Now at 43, with billions in aviation assets under his control, James rarely encountered such overt challenges. But today's events on Flight 527 had reminded him how little had changed for those without his resources or position. He opened a secure messaging app and sent a note to Vanessa research Atlantic Airways' history of discrimination complaints over the past 5 years. Also identify any internal diversity initiatives or training programs currently in place. Her response came quickly. On it, preliminary info shows 37 formal discrimination complaints filed with DOT against Atlantic over that period. Industry average for comparable airlines is 22. Current diversity initiatives appear limited to standard compliance training, plus a recently formed employee resource group. We'll send full details within 2 hours. James wasn't surprised by the numbers. They aligned with his observations about the airline's culture, not overtly discriminatory by policy perhaps, but certainly lacking in the proactive measures needed to prevent incidents like the one he'd witnessed. The flight attendant returned with dinner service, presenting the business class meal with practiced elegance. "Chef's selection tonight is herb-crusted salmon with quinoa pilaf," she explained. "We also have a vegetarian option if you prefer." As James dined, he considered the inner conflict he was experiencing. Part of him wanted to use his financial leverage to force immediate change at Atlantic Airways, to make an example of them that would send ripples throughout the industry. Another part recognized the need for a more measured approach that would create sustainable transformation rather than just compliance under threat. Power wielded as a blunt instrument rarely created lasting change. But power applied with precision and principle could reshape entire landscapes. His phone chimed with another message from Vanessa. "Additional information you might find relevant." Atlantic Airways recently abandoned a planned diversity training expansion after pushback from certain board members who considered it unnecessary political correctness. Source is a former HR executive who left the company 4 months ago. That detail was telling. It suggested the barriers to meaningful change might exist at the highest levels of the organization, the very people he would be meeting tomorrow. As the cabin lights dimmed for the overnight flight, James reclined his seat and closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to think. By morning, he needed a clear strategy, not just for the business negotiation, but for the more challenging conversation about corporate culture and responsibility. He thought of Alejandro Morales, who by now was probably in Boston, perhaps recounting the bizarre experience to his mother, whose birthday gift had nearly been lost to casual discrimination. He thought of Amelia Dawson, whose actions reflected not just individual bias, but a system that had allowed such attitudes to persist unchecked. And he thought of his own responsibility, not just as a businessman concerned with contracts and conditions, but as someone with the rare opportunity to influence a large organization's approach to basic human dignity. "The world doesn't change when power speaks to power," James murmured to himself. "It changes when power speaks for those without it." The path forward began to crystallize in his mind. This wasn't just about securing favorable lease terms or protecting his company's financial interests. It was about using his position to push for changes that might never make headlines but could profoundly affect countless passengers' experiences. As the aircraft crossed the Atlantic, James finalized his approach for the coming day's meetings. By the time dawn broke over the English countryside, he was ready not just with financial projections and contract parameters, but with a clear vision for how Atlantic Airways could begin transforming itself from within. The Atlantic Airways corporate headquarters in London occupied 6 floors of a gleaming glass tower near Canary Wharf. James arrived 15 minutes early for the 900 a.m. meeting, giving him time to observe the environment. The reception area featured the airline's signature blue and silver color scheme with scale models of their fleet displayed in illuminated cases. A large screen displayed a promotional video highlighting the carrier's commitment to exceptional customer experiences at every altitude. The contrast between this polished corporate image and yesterday's reality wasn't lost on James. Mr. Whitfield, a receptionist, approached with a tablet in hand. "We've been expecting you. Mr. Thompson and Ms. Ferris are ready in the executive conference room." James followed her through security doors and up an elevator to the top floor, where expansive views of London provided a dramatic backdrop for the day's negotiations. The conference room itself spoke of power and prestige, a long mahogany table, ergonomic leather chairs, and state-of-the-art presentation technology. Bradley Thompson rose immediately as James entered. At 58, Atlantic Airways' CFO had the weathered confidence of someone who had survived multiple industry downturns through tough financial management. His firm handshake and direct gaze projected reliability, a quality highly valued in the volatile airline business. "James, welcome," he said with practiced warmth. "I trust your flight was comfortable." "The business class upgrade was unexpected but appreciated," James replied with subtle emphasis. Diana Ferris approached next. The VP of Fleet Management was in her mid-40s with the precision and technical knowledge that came from decades in aircraft operations. Her handshake was equally firm, though her expression carried a hint of wariness. "Mr. Whitfield, thank you for joining us despite yesterday's unfortunate incidents," she said. "I've been fully briefed and want to assure you that we're taking this matter with the utmost seriousness." James nodded acknowledgement without immediately responding, setting his briefcase on the table and taking a seat. The dynamic was already established. They were on the defensive, aware that the financial stakes of today's discussion had been complicated by non-financial concerns. As James settled into his chair, an unexpected dramatic moment unfolded. Every screen in the conference room suddenly illuminated, displaying his name photo and full title, James Whitfield, CEO and founder, Horizon Aviation Capital. Current lessor of 17 Atlantic Airways aircraft. Potential financier of $2.8 billion fleet expansion. The executives froze, caught off guard by the display. For a suspended moment, the room was silent except for the soft hum of the ventilation system. The power dynamics had been made visually explicit in a way that words alone could not achieve. James raised an eyebrow slightly. "I see your system recognizes me." Thompson cleared his throat. Our IT department implemented an automatic VIP recognition protocol. I apologize for the dramatic display." With a few taps on a wall panel, Diana dimmed the screens, but the impact lingered, a visible reminder of James's influence over Atlantic Airways' future. "Before we begin the formal negotiations," Thompson said, sliding a folder across the table, "I wanted to inform you that we've taken immediate action regarding the situation on Flight 527. The flight attendant in question, Amelia Dawson, has been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation, and we've already initiated contact with the other affected passenger." Diana added quickly, "Customer experience is arranging appropriate compensation and a formal apology." James listened without comment, observing their eager presentation of these preliminary steps. When they finished, he remained silent for a moment longer than was comfortable, allowing the weight of expectation to build. The silence stretched until it became a presence in the room, forcing Thompson to shift uncomfortably in his chair. James simply watched, his stillness more powerful than any words could be. "I appreciate your prompt attention to the specific incident," he finally said, his voice measured. "But I'm more concerned with what it reveals about Atlantic Airways' underlying culture." Thompson's expression tightened slightly. "I assure you this was an isolated incident that doesn't reflect our corporate values." "Was it?" James asked simply. "My research indicates Atlantic Airways has received 37 formal discrimination complaints filed with the Department of Transportation in the past 5 years, significantly above the industry average. That suggests something more than an isolated incident." Diana and Bradley exchanged surprised glances. They hadn't expected him to come armed with such specific data. "Statistics can be misleading," Diana offered carefully. "The nature of complaints varies widely, and what I witnessed yesterday wasn't ambiguous." James interrupted, his tone remaining conversational but firm. "A senior flight attendant deliberately placed a passenger's personal property in the trash, then lied about it when confronted. When the passenger, who happened to be Hispanic, expressed legitimate concern, she became hostile and defensive rather than apologetic." He leaned forward slightly. More troubling was how comfortable she seemed with this behavior. That suggests an environment where such actions aren't adequately discouraged or addressed. Thompson cleared his throat. "We take all customer complaints seriously, Mr. Whitfield. And I want to emphasize that Atlantic Airways has a strict non-discrimination policy that all employees must acknowledge. Policies are only as effective as their implementation and enforcement," James countered. "I'm more interested in Atlantic Airways' active measures to prevent such incidents than in your retrospective handling of complaints." Diana straightened in her chair. "We conduct standard compliance training for all customer-facing staff, and last year we formed a diversity council among our employees to provide input on inclusive practices." "I'm aware," James nodded. "I'm also aware that a more comprehensive training program was recently shelved after opposition from certain board members who considered it unnecessary political correctness." "Is that accurate?" The executives exchanged another glance, clearly unsettled by his level of information. "There were budget considerations," Thompson offered weakly. James opened his briefcase and removed several documents, placing them carefully on the table. "Let's be direct about the situation. We're here to discuss Atlantic Airways' fleet financing needs, specifically the extension of leases on 17 aircraft currently in your fleet and the potential addition of 5 new wide-body jets." He tapped the top document. "This represents a financial commitment of approximately $2.8 billion over 12 years. It's a substantial investment from my company, and naturally we conduct thorough due diligence before entering such agreements." "Of course," Thompson nodded eagerly, clearly relieved to move toward business matters. "And we're prepared to discuss favorable terms that I believe will satisfy your financial requirements. My due diligence extends beyond financial projections," James continued as if Thompson hadn't spoken. "It includes evaluating the operational culture and values of potential partners. What I witnessed yesterday raises serious questions about whether Atlantic Airways currently meets our partnership standards." The room fell silent as the implications registered. James was essentially suggesting that the multi-billion-dollar deal might be in jeopardy. Diana was the first to recover. "Mr. Whitfield, while I understand your concerns, I hope we can separate an unfortunate, isolated incident from the larger business relationship that benefits both our organizations." James met her gaze directly. "Ms. Ferris, in my experience, there's no meaningful separation between how an organization treats its most vulnerable customers and how it conducts its business affairs. Both reflect the same underlying values and priorities." He turned to Thompson. "I'm still prepared to discuss the lease agreements today, but with an important modification to our standard terms." Thompson leaned forward, tension evident in his posture. What sort of modification? A comprehensive cultural accountability requirement, James stated. The financial terms will now be directly tied to measurable improvements in Atlantic Airways' approach to diversity, equity, and customer dignity across all service levels. He handed them each a document outlining specific requirements, enhanced training programs for all customer-facing staff, accountability metrics for managers, improved tracking and resolution of discrimination complaints, and regular third-party audits of progress. These aren't suggestions, James clarified. They're conditions of the financing agreement. Meeting these benchmarks will result in the favorable terms we've discussed. Failing to meet them will trigger penalty clauses and potentially accelerated repayment requirements. Thompson's face had grown increasingly pale as he scanned the document. This is unprecedented. So was witnessing a flight attendant throw a passenger's belongings in the trash, James replied evenly. Dignity isn't something that can be thrown away like trash. Unlike that bag once lost, it's much harder to recover. His words hung in the air, simple but profound. The executives looked at each other, then back at the document as the full weight of the situation settled over them. We would need to review these requirements with our legal team, Diana said, her tone professional but strained. Of course, James agreed. I'm not asking for an immediate signature, but I am making it clear that any agreement moving forward will include these conditions. He paused, then continued with quiet intensity. This isn't about extracting concessions or exerting leverage. It's about ensuring that the substantial resources my company provides to Atlantic Airways support an organization that treats every passenger with basic dignity, not just those in premium cabins or those who look the part. The room fell silent again, the only sound the gentle hum of the building's ventilation system. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, London carried on its business, unaware of the transformation potentially taking place within this glass tower. Finally, Thompson spoke, his voice having lost some of its practiced confidence. You've given us a great deal to consider, Mr. Whitfield. Perhaps we should take a brief recess before continuing our discussions. I think that would be wise, James agreed, gathering his materials. I'll wait in the reception area. As he stepped out of the conference room, James could hear the immediate buzz of concerned conversation behind him. He had disrupted their carefully prepared negotiation strategy, introducing elements that most financial discussions deliberately avoided. He found a quiet corner of the reception area and checked his phone. A message from Vanessa awaited update on Alejandro Morales. He's been contacted by Atlantic Airways' customer service team. Reports being treated with surprising attention and respect. Wanted to thank you for your intervention. James smiled slightly. The immediate response to the specific incident was appropriate, but the real test would be whether Atlantic Airways embraced the broader changes necessary to prevent future occurrences. 20 minutes later, Thompson's assistant approached. Mr. Whitfield, they're ready for you now. When James re-entered the conference room, he immediately sensed a shift in energy. Thompson and Ferris were seated side by side, their postures suggesting a unified front reached through hurried consultation. Mr. Whitfield, Thompson began, We've discussed your proposed conditions and have a response. Diana continued, While some aspects may require adjustment to align with our existing governance structures, we accept the fundamental premise. Atlantic Airways is committed to meaningful improvement in our approach to diversity and customer dignity. James studied their expressions, looking beyond the corporate language for signs of genuine commitment. I'm pleased to hear that, but I want to be clear, this isn't about superficial changes or temporary adjustments to secure financing. It's about transformation that becomes embedded in how Atlantic Airways operates at every level. Understood. Thompson nodded. And to demonstrate our immediate commitment, I've just received authorization from our CEO to reinstate and expand the comprehensive training program that was previously shelved. Implementation will begin within 30 days. James nodded, recognizing this as a positive first step. That's encouraging. Now shall we discuss the specific benchmarks and accountability mechanisms? For the next 3 hours, they engaged in detailed negotiations, not just about interest rates and maintenance requirements, but about metrics for measuring progress in staff training, completion, reduction in bias-related complaints, and improvements in customer satisfaction scores across demographic groups. By mid-afternoon, they had reached agreement on the major points. Legal teams would finalize language over the coming days, but the framework was established. Atlantic Airways would receive the favorable financing terms they needed, contingent upon demonstrable progress in creating a more equitable experience for all passengers. As they concluded, Thompson extended his hand. "This wasn't the negotiation I expected, Mr. Whitfield, but I believe it may prove more valuable to Atlantic Airways in the long term than mere financial terms. The most important negotiations often take us in unexpected directions," James replied, accepting the handshake. Diana Ferris stepped forward. "Before you go, I'd like to say something personally." Her professional demeanor softened slightly. "What happened on that flight was wrong. Full stop. And while we're addressing it officially through corporate channels, I want you to know that many of us within Atlantic Airways are genuinely troubled that it happened and committed to preventing similar incidents." James appreciated the sincerity in her voice. "That's good to hear, Ms. Ferris. Sometimes the most important changes begin with individuals acknowledging uncomfortable truths." As he departed the building and stepped into the London afternoon, James felt a measured satisfaction. Today's agreement wouldn't generate headlines or public recognition, but its impact would potentially reach thousands of passengers who would never know his name or role in improving their experience. True power isn't measured by who you can silence, he thought to himself, but by whose voices you choose to amplify. Some forms of power operated best from behind the scenes, not in dramatic confrontations, but in quiet insistence on better standards. And sometimes the most effective advocacy came not from protest, but from strategic application of influence in places where decisions were made. James hailed a taxi to his hotel, already mentally composing an update for Vanessa and contemplating next steps. The journey that had begun with a simple observation flight had evolved into something far more significant, not just for Atlantic Airways, but for his own understanding of how to effectively wield the influence he had spent decades building. 3 days after James Whitfield's eventful flight, Amelia Dawson sat rigidly in a straight-backed chair inside Atlantic Airways' Human Resources Department. The office was deliberately bland, neutral colors, corporate artwork, and the kind of impersonal furnishings designed to neither comfort nor intimidate. But despite the room's attempted neutrality, Amelia felt the weight of judgment pressing down on her. Across the desk, Richard Palmer, the airline's HR director, reviewed documents on his tablet with methodical precision. At 52, Palmer had the measured demeanor of someone who had conducted countless difficult conversations throughout his career. His silver-streaked hair and wire-rimmed glasses contributed to an appearance of authoritative impartiality. "Ms. Dawson," he began, looking up from his screen, "thank you for coming in today. As you know, we're addressing serious allegations regarding your conduct on Flight 527 from Atlanta to New York 3 days ago." "I was simply following procedure," Amelia replied, her voice tight. Unattended bags represent a security risk that Palmer held up a hand. "Let's be precise about what we're discussing. The investigation has gathered substantial evidence, including statements from multiple passengers and crew members. I'd like to review these with you before discussing next steps." He turned his tablet to face her, displaying a carefully organized timeline of events. First, there's the matter of requiring a passenger, James Whitfield, to gate-check his appropriately sized carry-on bag. 6 witnesses confirmed the bag met size requirements and that ample storage space was available. Amelia shifted uncomfortably. It appeared oversized from my vantage point. Next, Palmer continued without acknowledging her explanation. "We have the more serious incident involving passenger Alejandro Morales' bag. He swiped to a new screen displaying statement summaries. 11 passengers and 2 crew members confirm that you removed Mr. Morales' bag from the overhead bin while he was briefly in the lavatory during turbulence. Palmer looked at her directly. Most significantly, 3 witnesses, including Mr. Whitfield, observed you placing the bag in a trash receptacle in the forward galley, not in a secure location for unattended items as specified in our procedures manual. Amelia's face flushed. That's an exaggeration. I temporarily placed it aside while Ms. Dawson Palmer interrupted gently but firmly. We have video. He turned the tablet again, playing a brief clip, obviously captured by a passenger's phone. The footage clearly showed Amelia placing the black duffel bag into a large trash bag, her furtive glances confirming she knew this action was inappropriate. The blood drained from Amelia's face as she watched herself on screen. Her own actions, played back to her with unflinching clarity, suddenly looked different from this new perspective. Not the justified actions of a professional maintaining standards, but the petty power play of someone targeting a passenger based on appearance. Additionally, Palmer continued when confronted about the missing bag you initially denied knowledge of its whereabouts, then claimed it was being handled according to protocol. When the bag was discovered in the trash and returned to Mr. Morales, you offered no apology, and instead suggested he was at fault. Amelia's hands twisted in her lap. The passengers were becoming disruptive. I was trying to maintain cabin order. Finally, Palmer said, as if she hadn't spoken, when Mr. Whitfield calmly pointed out that your actions were inappropriate, you responded with hostility and what multiple witnesses described as thinly veiled racial undertones. He set the tablet down and folded his hands. Ms. Dawson, your personnel file shows 7 previous complaints of a similar nature, though none quite this severe. In each case, you provided explanations that supervisors accepted. But the pattern and this most recent incident paint a concerning picture. Those were all misunderstandings. Amelia insisted, her voice rising slightly. Passengers often don't understand the pressures we face or the security protocols we must follow. Our security protocols never include placing passengers' belongings in trash receptacles, Palmer stated flatly, nor do they involve treating certain passengers with less respect than others. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed Amelia's face. Seen through the lens of others, her actions appeared indefensible. He retrieved an envelope from his desk drawer. After thorough review and in accordance with our employment policies, Atlantic Airways has made the decision to terminate your employment effective immediately. Amelia stared at the envelope, momentarily speechless. Terminated. For a minor procedural deviation for deliberately disposing of a passenger's property, lying about your actions when confronted, and creating a hostile environment based on apparent bias, Palmer clarified. This packet contains details about your final compensation benefits, continuation options, and the appeal process should you wish to contest this decision. Amelia's face contorted with anger and disbelief. This is about that Whitfield person, isn't it? Who is he anyway? Some executive's friend? Palmer maintained his professional demeanor. The decision is based on evidence from multiple sources and your documented history of similar incidents. Mr. Whitfield's statement was certainly considered, as were those of other passengers and crew members, including your colleague Gabriela Ramirez. Amelia's voice cracked. She reported me too. Ms. Ramirez provided a factual account when asked. Palmer replied neutrally, as did the purser and captain. Something in Amelia began to crack the careful shell of justification she had built around her actions. For a fleeting moment, she saw herself not as she had always imagined, but as others experienced her, not the protector of standards, but the enforcer of arbitrary rules applied selectively based on her own biases. Amelia's shock gradually transformed into smoldering resentment. 12 years I've served this airline. 12 years of perfect attendance, working holidays, covering extra shifts, and you're throwing me away because of one passenger complaint. This isn't about service duration, Palmer said quietly. It's about conduct that violates our most basic standards for how we treat our customers and one another. He stood, signaling the meeting's conclusion. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings. Your company credentials have been deactivated. The finality of it struck Amelia like a physical blow. As security personnel appeared at the door, the reality of her situation began to sink in. Her career, the identity she had built over 12 years, was over, not because of a major safety violation or criminal act, but because of how she had treated people she deemed unimportant. 2 days later, after cycling through stages of denial, anger, and desperate bargaining, Amelia sat in her apartment surrounded by job search websites and unanswered emails to industry contacts. Her attempts to secure references from former supervisors had been met with polite deflection. Her calls to the flight attendants union had yielded sympathetic but ultimately unhelpful advice about moving on and learning from the experience. Through persistence and the help of a former colleague, Amelia had managed to obtain James Whitfield's contact information. She stared at the number on her phone screen, finger hovering over the call button. What would she say? That he had ruined her career? That she deserved another chance? That she hadn't meant any harm? After 3 false starts, she finally completed the call. Each ring increased her anxiety until unexpectedly he answered. James Whitfield speaking. Amelia's prepared speech evaporated. This is Amelia Dawson, from the flight from Atlanta, the flight attendant. A brief silence followed, then James's measured voice. I recognize the name. What can I do for you, Ms. Dawson? They fired me, she said, emotion making her voice unsteady. 12 years with Atlantic Airways, and they terminated me because of what happened on that flight. I see James replied, his tone neutral but not unkind. Did you know this would happen? Amelia demanded, anger seeping into her voice. When you reported me, did you know they would fire me over one mistake? Was it one mistake, Ms. Dawson? James asked quietly. The question hung in the air between them, forcing Amelia to confront the pattern that had led to this moment. For the first time, she began to see her actions not as isolated incidents, but as manifestations of deeply held assumptions about who deserved respect and who didn't. I was just doing my job, she insisted, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. Maybe I was a bit harsh sometimes, but that's what it takes to maintain standards. You don't understand the pressures we face. I understand that you deliberately placed a passenger's personal property in the trash, James replied evenly. That goes beyond harshness. It reflects a fundamental disregard for someone's dignity. It wasn't about, Amelia began, then stopped herself. She had been about to deny any bias, but something in James's calm certainty made the denial stick in her throat. Had she treated Alejandro differently because of how he looked? Would she have put a white businessman's bag in the trash? The questions were uncomfortable, the answers even more so. After a moment, James spoke again. Miss Dawson, I didn't call for your termination. I reported what I witnessed because it was wrong. The airline made its own decision based on your actions, and I suspect your history. So, what am I supposed to do now? Amelia asked, her voice smaller. My entire career is over. Your career with Atlantic Airways is over, James corrected gently. What happens next is largely up to you. This could be an ending, or it could be an opportunity for reflection and growth. Amelia laughed bitterly. Easy for you to say. You clearly have power and influence. I've lost everything. You've lost a job, James countered. Not your skills, your experience, or your capacity to change. The question is whether you're willing to honestly examine why this happened and what it might teach you. The conversation wasn't going as Amelia had expected. She had anticipated either satisfying confrontation or potential intervention on her behalf. Instead, she found herself faced with uncomfortable introspection. I didn't mean to, she began, then faltered. I never thought of myself as... Again, she couldn't complete the thought. We rarely see ourselves clearly, James observed. Our actions often reveal truths we're not ready to acknowledge. Amelia was silent for several seconds, tears of frustration building. So that's it. No second chance. Second chances aren't given, Ms. Dawson. They're earned through recognition, responsibility, and change. James's voice remained free of condemnation despite his direct words. I believe in second chances, but they begin with honest self-examination. As the conversation drew to a close, Amelia felt strangely unsatisfied, yet somehow unburdened. James hadn't offered what she wanted: intervention, absolution, or even the satisfaction of a proper villain to blame. Instead, he had offered something she needed but hadn't sought the mirror of accountability held up without malice. After they disconnected, Amelia sat motionless, her apartment suddenly feeling too quiet, too empty. The familiar narrative she had constructed of herself as the victim of political correctness of passengers who didn't understand aviation realities of a company that had betrayed her loyalty began to crumble under the weight of simple truth. For the first time, she allowed herself to truly see the moment from Alejandro's perspective, the violation, the humiliation, the injustice. And from there, painful questions emerged. How many others had she treated with similar disregard? How often had she applied different standards based on appearance, accent, or assumption? The answers wouldn't come easily or quickly. But as Amelia finally opened her termination packet and began processing the logistics of her new reality, something shifted inside her. The journey ahead would be difficult, but necessary not just for her future employment prospects, but for the person she might yet become. The journey that began with a bag tossed into trash had transformed not just an airline, but the invisible dimensions of dignity that defined the space between strangers in transit. From a seemingly small incident on Flight 527, emerged changes that would impact thousands of travelers who would never know the full story behind their improved experiences. Atlantic Airways underwent a profound transformation implementing their Passenger Dignity Initiative that became a model for the industry. James Whitfield continued to use his influence behind the scenes, making dignity metrics a standard part of his company's financing agreements, and Alejandro Morales, once the subject of casual disrespect, became a powerful advocate for equitable treatment in travel. True power isn't measured by who you can silence, but by whose voices you choose to amplify. And sometimes the most meaningful change begins with someone simply refusing to remain silent in the face of injustice. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps bring more stories like this to light, stories that remind us how a single act of speaking up can create ripples of positive change far beyond what we might imagine. Remember, dignity isn't what others give you, it's what no one can take away unless you let them.